Most of my work nights looked the same, and this one didn't feel different at the time. I do verification and cleanup for a small compliance contractor. Nothing classified. Mostly comparing leaked datasets against public records, checking integrity, flagging obvious fabrications. I work late because it's quieter and because I got used to it. Coffee goes cold. Browser tabs pile up. I keep a mirrored drive running out of habit, not paranoia. Hashes logged, folders labeled by date. Same structure every night. I didn't realize at the time how automatic my decisions had become. If something looks plausibly institutional, I treat it that way until proven otherwise. That's just easier. Around 1:40 UTC, I was skimming a low-traffic forum thread. No headline, just a string of replies with truncated links. Someone mentioned retired research environments being mirrored before decommission. No warning language, no hype. The post was time-stamped 3 days earlier and hadn't been touched since. I copied the links into a Scratch file and moved on for a while. I almost forgot about it. When I came back, I checked the URLs through a sandboxed connection. 2 separate addresses. Both resolved, slowly, like older infrastructure. The landing directories were bare. No splash pages, no manifest files. Just folders. The naming conventions stood out. Numeric prefixes, department-style abbreviations, year-based segmentation. I've seen similar layouts in public grant repositories and FOIA dumps. It didn't look curated. It looked abandoned. I logged the access times and pulled directory trees without opening files. The structures mirrored each other loosely, but not exactly. One had a heavier emphasis on finance and staffing support. The other leaned toward assessments and review cycles. Both used the same checksum format in their index files. That's what convinced me to mirror them locally. Not curiosity, familiarity. The download took longer than expected. Bandwidth throttled itself after a few gigabytes. I let it run while I cleaned up another dataset. When it finished, I verified hashes against the remote indexes. No mismatches. No encryption prompts. No access banners. Just data. I labeled the drives and noted the timestamps. Mirror, a completed 3:12 UTC. Mirror B, completed 3:47 UTC. Looking back, there were small things that didn't line up. Missing README files, empty image directories with intact captions, ethics documentation filed under revisions instead of approvals. At the time, I chalked that up to sloppy archiving. It happens more than people think. I didn't think of it as finding anything. It felt like routine intake. Another pair of datasets to sort, categorize, and eventually forget. I started with what I labeled Mirror A, mostly because its index sorted cleanly. The root folder contained a completed program, or at least something marked that way. Dates ranged across 7 years. Everything after the final quarter was tagged post-close. That's a normal convention. I've seen it in terminated grants and mothballed pilot studies. The bulk of the material was administrative. Budget forecasts, then revisions. Staffing rosters with names replaced by role IDs after the 3rd year. Ethics waivers filed annually, each one slightly longer than the last. I didn't see a single document that tried to summarize the project in plain language. Everything assumed prior familiarity. That's common in internal environments. You don't explain what everyone already knows. I didn't realize at the time how much effort it took to avoid stating the obvious. The quarterly summaries focused on outcomes without context. Metrics shifted categories midstream. Participant counts were reported, then replaced by retention percentages, then by engagement continuity. Dropout rates rose steadily, but they were never framed as a problem. They were just annotated, cross-referenced, and carried forward. There were photographs, technically. I never opened the files themselves. The captions were enough. Asset IDs, camera types, timestamps. Most were marked non-releasable. Some had redaction notes attached, explaining why even internal access was limited. CCTV stills followed the same pattern. Frame numbers listed. Locations abbreviated. No descriptions of content, only of why the content couldn't be circulated. Language flattened as the project progressed. Early documents used active phrasing. Later ones shifted to passive constructions and conditional verbs. Responsibility blurred. Decisions were attributed to committees, then to review outcomes, then to compliance alignment. It wasn't evasive, exactly. It felt optimized. I kept telling myself this was what mature programs look like near the end. Complexity increases. Documentation becomes defensive. That's not unusual. One termination memo stood out because it was short. Most of the others were padded with rationale and references. This one wasn't. It contained a single evaluative sentence near the end, set apart from the rest. Further application is not advised under current governance models. There was no signature, just an authorization code and a TIMESTAMP dot. After that point, the files shifted tone. Post-close assessments replaced summaries. Staffing losses were recorded without replacement plans. Audit frequency increased, even though activity decreased. The final documents didn't argue that the project failed. They argued, quietly, that it couldn't be made safe enough to continue. I remember thinking that was a strange distinction. Usually things end because they don't work. This felt more like something that worked, but not in a way anyone could use responsibly. I noted it, flagged a few inconsistencies for later, and moved on to the second archive without much hesitation. I moved on to Mirabee, assuming it was separate. Different directory name, different top-level code. That was my initial read. The structure underneath was familiar, though. Same checksum conventions. Same review cadence. Even the folder permissions followed the same logic, with read access widening as the project aged instead of narrowing. That's not typical, but it matched what I'd just seen. This archive felt more active, or at least it had been when it closed. There were training documents up front. Not manuals exactly, more like alignment materials. Slides converted to PDFs, rubrics with scoring bands, revision histories that showed frequent minor edits instead of major rewrites. The subject matter wasn't described directly. Everything was framed in terms of evaluation. Charts showed up early. Attention decay plotted over time. Memory variance tracked across cohorts. Something labeled baseline adjustment recalculated every quarter. There was no explanation of what baseline meant, just formulas and confidence intervals. I didn't question that at first. A lot of internal research assumes shared definitions. The raw media wasn't there. Instead, there were summaries of media reviews, counts of hours watched, flags raised, compliance percentages, body cam audits reduced to tables, CCTV references without attached files. It looked deliberate, like someone decided the interpretations mattered more than the source material. Oversight got complicated as the timeline progressed. One committee split into 2, then 3. Their scopes overlapped. Recommendations conflicted, but were all marked accepted. Responsibility diffused in a way that made it hard to tell who was actually steering anything. Again, that's not unheard of in long-running programs. I didn't realize at the time how often this archive referenced codes from Mirror A, not explicitly, just in footnotes. Shared vendor IDs. A funding line that carried over unchanged. A compliance framework cited as validated under prior environment. It took a few passes to see the pattern. The evaluation summaries were consistent about one thing. Individual performance wasn't the focus. Variance was. How much deviation the system could tolerate before outputs became unreliable. Adjustments weren't made to participants. They were made to procedures. Looking back, that's what connected the two archives for me. The first one documented what happened when participation collapsed. The second one seemed designed to see how much collapse could be absorbed without anyone needing to intervene directly. I remember telling myself this was abstract work, systems theory, contingency planning, nothing personal. It helped that the documents never described anyone as a person, just as a data point with persistence issues. I started laying the two archives side by side, not thematically, just structurally. Same time blocks, same revision intervals. When I aligned the timelines, a third layer became obvious. There were derivative folders that didn't belong cleanly to either experiment. Draft materials, transitional documents, things that looked unfinished but were versioned anyway. Most of these sat under neutral labels like guidance, internal, or framework adaptation. They weren't raw research. They were abstractions, contingency matrices built from outcomes rather than methods, training modules that referenced performance thresholds without explaining where those thresholds came from. I recognized the formatting immediately. It matched policy toolkits I'd seen in public sector work, just stripped down. The language was flatter than the experimental summaries. Ethical considerations were reduced to bullet points. Exceptions were pre-approved in blocks, not case by case. Accountability chains shortened over time. Early drafts listed multiple review authorities. Later ones collapsed that into a single sign-off role with delegated discretion. No justification was given. It was treated as optimization. There were slide decks archived as PDFs. I didn't open the images themselves, just the index files. Titles like operational continuity under degraded participation and baseline acceptance training pilot. Each slide had an index number, a usage log, and a deployment status. Some were marked circulated, others embedded. None were marked experimental. Photographs appeared only as catalog entries. No thumbnails, just asset IDs, capture dates, and redaction flags. The captions described settings I recognized from the first archive CCTV summaries. Municipal buildings, temporary facilities, classrooms repurposed as assessment spaces. The photos weren't evidence. They were documentation of implementation. I remember pausing to get coffee around then. It was late, and I was tired enough to skim. Looking back, that's probably why it took me a while to accept what I was seeing. These weren't reports about what might happen. They were instructions built from what already had. I didn't find any statement of intent. No mission declaration tying it together. Just outcomes feeding into procedures. The experiments weren't referenced as experiments anymore. They were cited as validation environments. Their failures weren't framed as failures. They were boundary conditions. By the end of that review, it was hard to think of the original archives as isolated. They read more like pilot runs, not for technologies, but for governance under strain. The documents didn't describe collapse. They assumed it and focused on how to keep systems legible when people stopped being reliable inputs. That was the first time I stopped thinking of this as historical material. I noticed the change because one of my scripts flagged a permissions mismatch. Nothing dramatic, just a new directory appearing between two sync cycles. The timestamp didn't line up with my activity, but that happens with mirrored systems. I assumed it was a delayed index update. The folder name followed the same internal naming logic as the rest, except it included an external review code I hadn't seen before. It wasn't personalized in a way that stood out immediately. Just an alphanumeric string that, when I checked, matched my access hash with 2 additional suffixes. I told myself it was coincidence. These systems reuse identifiers. Inside were summary documents, not raw files. Observational reports, engagement, duration, read depth, extraction attempts. Disclosure risk scored on a 5-point scale. No commentary, just metrics. The tone was neutral, like HR analytics or compliance audits I'd worked with before. The subject field was populated with generic labels. Analyst, a handler, external. One document was marked active review. It contained a single evaluation paragraph and a table of thresholds. I didn't recognize the model, but the variables were familiar. Time to disengagement, archive propagation, probability, containment, confidence. At the bottom was a line that stood out because it was the only direct address in the entire archive, subject active. No intervention recommended at this stage. I didn't know what stage meant in that context. I still don't. At the time, I treated it as a poorly scoped monitoring artifact. Some internal team watching traffic patterns, maybe. The darknet is full of half-abandoned research environments. What did register was how consistent it was with everything else. The experiments weren't documenting beginnings or breakthroughs. They were documenting endings, attrition curves, attention decay, how long systems remain readable after participants stop engaging in good faith. The outcomes weren't catastrophic. They were stable. That's why I decided not to release the full archive. There were internal risk models attached to the observational summaries. They treated disclosure itself as a variable. Partial release scored lower risk than complete transparency. Metadata was preferable to narrative. Outlines reduced amplification. I backed everything up to cold storage, verified checksums, then corrupted my access keys. Not wiped. Just altered enough to fail verification. That was logged too, which I expected. This post is the last artifact I'm producing from it. It isn't meant to convince anyone. The archive accounted for disbelief. It modeled it. Preservation mattered more than understanding. That seems to be the final requirement these systems were designed to satisfy.